Hi guys, Soup here. Simhub recently came out with an update for the SimMagic haptic pedal reactors on the P1000s, the P2000s, or the P500s. And I wanted to go over my settings and why I have it set up the way that I have it set up. Hopefully it can help you out and can kind of streamline your setup. So in the recent update from Simhub, my jaw dropped because I didn't even realize this update came out. But it looks like in December of 2024, Simhub released an update. And instead of programming your motors from the Shake It Motors menu, which is where they used to be, if we go to motors output, you'll see at the bottom of the screen it says P1000s and the Rep 500 and TBRs. Those are now available as device with dedicated profile settings. If you click this button, add new device, and then go ahead and turn off your motor feedback in the Shake It Motors menu, you'll see that a new device will show up in your devices menu, and you'll see the SimMagic haptic pedal reactors. Now, assuming that they are plugged in and powered on, they'll show up as connected. Now what you'll see is previously in the Shake It Motors settings, you were only able to set a frequency for each pedal, each motor itself, individually. But now you can take each individual effect and you can change the frequency for each individual effect. There might be better settings for ACC, for Le Mans Ultimate, but for iRacing specifically, this is the settings that I recommend if you're trying to use these, not necessarily for immersion, but for getting faster on the track. So detecting your wheel slips, wheel locks, detecting your traction losses, and detecting when ABS is active and you're maybe squashing the brake a little too hard. Let's start here at the bottom. Let's talk about traction control. It would be cool if traction control, if there was a setting in the pedals for traction control, but unfortunately, the effect is not supported in iRacing. So there is no active information stream that can go from iRacing to Simhub that will tell Simhub when traction control is activated in order to enable an effect on your pedal. So we're not gonna use it. We can't use it, right? Wheel spin and lock, same thing, okay? The effect is not supported on iRacing. All right, so we can't use that. Now what we can use is something called wheel slip. And while it says iRacing does not provide any wheel slip information, it uses an RPM-based detection algorithm to detect when your wheel is actually slipping. So when your RPM spike and that wheel starts spinning a whole lot, Simhub detects it as a wheel slip and translates that to a motor rumble effect, right, in your pedal. So that's kind of the explanation, because some of you may look at this and say, well, why aren't you using this? Why aren't you using that? Well, the reason I'm not using it is because the effect's not supported really in iRacing. That's the bottom line. And remember, these settings are for getting faster on the track. This is not for immersion, right? If I wanted to go for immersion, I probably wouldn't even use pedal motors on my pedals. I would probably use motors under the pedal base and maybe in the four corners of my rig. But I'm going for using feedback from motors to get faster on the track. Since I can't feel the G-forces that I would feel in a car, I need to translate that to my pedals and vibrations. You can see, overall, going over settings from top to bottom, ABS active. I used to not use it, to be honest with you. I just used the lights on my wheel, but I finally decided that I needed to get that feeling. I needed to feel when ABS was active, so I decided to enable it. And some of you may be like, why did you enable it on your clutch? Well, the reason I enabled it on my clutch is because I want to be able to feel wheel lock and traction loss in the brake when I'm pressing it, which is what I have enabled here. But I also want to know when ABS is active, but I want it to feel very different than the wheel lock and the traction loss. So I've enabled it on my clutch because all my clutch is doing is clunking whenever I shift gears. You might be able to hear it as I shift gears. You might be able to hear that clunk in the background, maybe not. But that's a 15 hertz clunk, quick 80 millisecond clunk that happens every time I shift gears, only in the clutch. Whereas the ABS is set to only be active in the clutch, and obviously it's only gonna be active when I'm pressing the brake, right? Even though the brake is not enabled as one of the motors. So that's kind of the rationale behind it. I set it at 20 hertz too, because I want it to be real shocking. And so if you think about hertz, if you think about a frequency wave, right? The closer together a frequency wave, so the more fine the vibration is, those waves are gonna be real close together, right? So it's gonna be very fine vibration. 20 hertz is farther apart. It's a little bit of a lower, so that will be a very clunky motor feel. It'll be duk, 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 instead of, you know? I hope you love my impressions as I do this. So that's the reason, and I have it set as an 80 millisecond duration whenever ABS is active. So when my ABS goes active, that clutch is clunking, duk, 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 and I know that my ABS is active in conjunction with the lights on my wheel. So I know I'm pressing that pedal just a little bit too hard. So that's the rationale behind ABS. Gear shift, there's really no good reason to have this other than it's cool, right? Like it's a 15 hertz. I set the effects frequency to 15 hertz. I have this set to 100%. I want to feel it, right? And when I shift those gears, I can feel that clunk. You can see it active on there. It's awesome, right? It's actually just cool to have. But I know a lot of people put the brake motor on and none of the other ones. I think it's kind of cool to be able to program ABS into the clutch. You still feel it in the brake, right? But it's not right behind your foot. That way you can leave that feedback for other things, like maybe when you're lightly braking and you want to feel traction loss. You're not necessarily activating the ABS because you're not smashing down on the brakes, but you want to be able to feel when are you braking that traction loss, which I'll talk about later on the really light tap of the brakes. Or maybe you want to even know that you are tapping the brake, right? So you want that little bit of vibration, because sometimes it's hard to tell when you're at 0 or 1%, when you're just coming out of a trail brake or just barely trying to ease into a corner. Wheel lock. So I have this one also set to 100% because if my wheels lock, that's not good, right? Like you never want your wheels to lock when you're racing, right? No situation, unless you're like trying to avoid an accident. And even then you're losing traction. You're not gonna control the car. So you don't want your wheels to lock. So obviously I have this one set at 1 Hondo P, 100%. I have it triggered when the brake reaches 1% because I want it active at all times. I want to know as soon as my wheels lock, right? So gamma factor, you can see as I lower this value, it changes the curve above, right? Lowering the value makes smaller effects less intense and creates a more gradual transition between small effects and large effects. So if we were talking about bumps, for example, on the road, a little bump would feel, very little, and a big bump would feel very large. It'd be a very natural transition, okay? If you increase to over 1, increase the gamma factor to over 1, it creates a different curve and there's a sharper response to subtle inputs. So a little bump is still gonna give you a lot of feeling. That's just an example, that's the best example I can think of. Now threshold is the point at which you're going to feel those effects, right? At what point are you going to feel the bump, for this, to use the same example, in your motor, right? Minimum force is at what point does Simhub detect that bump to send the signal across to your foot. So it's two different things. You're saying with threshold, you're saying I only want to feel it here. With minimum force, you're saying I don't want to feel the pebble. I want to feel the big bump that comes across only. And then input gain is simply the amplification of how strong that signal is once it comes from iRacing over into Simhub and then into your foot. Is it going to amplify it? Input gain, way higher. Is it not going to amplify it and keep it the same? Input gain needs to be set at 0. Hopefully that helps explain those 4 settings, and I'll go through each of my settings individually so you guys can understand my rationale behind all of them. And it may not even make sense because I have trouble understanding what these values mean sometimes. The best way to figure out if these values work for you is to just mess around and drive with them and change them as you're driving so you understand how they change the vibrations for each individual. I can't tell you, I can show you guys my base settings, but I can't tell you what you're going to like, right? So you really have to drive to adjust these on your own. You can use my settings as a base if you're looking for something and then adjust it, but I can't tell you exactly what to set these as because it's all personal preference. I can tell you that I tried to adjust these car for car, like change them in every car, and it just was too much for me to handle, so I stopped doing it altogether. I just picked one setting and left it in all the cars, and then eventually, as you drive the car, you get used to the wheel lock you feel in the FF1600 versus the GR86. You're going to get used to that feeling. You're going to get used to that difference. You're going to know how to push that car to its limits based on the feedback that you get with the same exact settings. So for wheel lock, I have my gamma factor set to 1.2, my threshold set to 8, minimum force set to 0, and then input gain set to 250. Let's move down to wheel slip. So this is a little different. And notice I have the base frequency set to 30, so a little bit more of a clunky feel. Not so much a vibration, more of a clunky feel for wheel lock, because I want that to be real shocking. Now, as I get down to wheel slip and traction loss, I kind of have similar settings for both of these. This is kind of background noise. Like, I just want to know when it's happening, but I don't want it to be as shocking as wheel lock and ABS, right? I really want to know when those things are happening. So wheel slip, I have set to 85% volume, right? I have the gamma factor set to 1.7. I have the threshold set to 10, and I have the input gain set to 90. So not quite as powerful as the wheels lock. Now I noticed with this one, I did make some adjustments with this because this setting is a new one that I've added since I moved over to using these as devices in Simhub instead of using them as in the Shake It Motors module. So I noticed the wheel slip, since it's a calculation, it's a lot of feedback. You get a lot of noise while you're driving. So I decided, you know what, we're gonna lower this one down. So I lowered the gamma factor down to 1.7. I don't wanna feel a ton of feedback. I lowered the input gain down. I left the threshold the same. I probably could have raised it a little bit, but I left it the same. Frequency for this one's 35, so a little bit more of a vibration than I would say a clunk. And I only feel this one in my throttle. That's what I want to know. Am I pounding on this throttle too hard? If I am, then my wheels are going to slip and I'm going to feel it in that throttle as I'm pushing it down. And then finally traction loss, which is essentially the same thing, except for I want to feel that in both my brake pedal and my throttle pedal, right? And I have this one with a little bit more of a sharper response on the high end, with the gamma factor being 3.0 and the threshold being 10, and a little bit more of an input gain than the wheel slip at 120. And the reason is because, like I said, with the wheel slip, there's just a lot of noise through iRacing. There's just a lot of noise, so I needed to tone that setting down a little bit. Now the base frequency is going to be 40, so even more of a vibration than that wheel slip. But at least I can differentiate, right? And I'm feeling these both in the brake and the throttle. You can differentiate between 35 and 40, and definitely differentiate between like 40 and my lowest setting, which is 15 for my gear shift, which is a hard clunk, right? Hardware settings. So this is another thing that's important. So I like to put block effects when not pressed for my brake and throttle. I don't press my clutch all the time. I want it to clunk whenever I change the gear, so I have that one not checked for that, and I don't have a pressure level because it's not checked, right? I want these as soon as there's pressure on it, I want it. So that's why I probably should set these both to 1, to be honest with you, because I want to feel it at 1, not at 0. So that's the settings for hardware settings. Under effects, under calibration, turn this all the way down if you don't want it to auto-calibrate for you. And I don't want it to auto-calibrate for me. I want to do all my own calibrations. I'm learning just as much as you guys. I'm not the guru on this. This is just what I've tested and tried out. So try your settings out. Tell me what you recommend. And let me know in the comments how you guys are using these haptic pedal reactors on your sim rig. And there we go. That's an explanation. That's the best explanation. I don't know. Figure it out. Give it a shot. Let me know what you find out in the comments. Like and subscribe. You know, all the YouTube stuff.